Well guys, I've had better days than today doing car videos. I've got an issue with my own car. That's a 2000 Pontiac Trans Am WS6. After a weekend of spirited driving at the track, sounds like I did a little bit of damage possibly to the rear end. Doesn't seem serious, but there's a little bit of a clunk sound when you take off from the line. It feels to me like it's driveline related. It could be a bad U-joint, but I actually think it's going to be some kind of backlash issue with the ring and pinion. That's what it kind of sounds like and what it kind of feels like to me. But we're going to go under the car and take a look. I do intend on doing a video on differential rebuild for a rear-wheel drive car eventually, but I don't plan on doing it on my car because I really don't have time, and I'm hoping that I don't need to. So let's go ahead under the car and see if we can find where this problem is. Oh, hey, you're not supposed to see that yet. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just a visual inspection on the suspension, which I don't believe is the problem, and I'm definitely not finding anything that's loose. And I'm going to check the exhaust, and it's pretty stable. That can cause a little bit of a clunking sound, but this is definitely driveline related that I'm having. I noticed you can see the Borla symbol on the exhaust muffler here. I should really cover that up for the video. There's nothing that I hate more than shameless product and service placements on YouTube videos. All right, and feeling here, this is definitely going to be my issue. There is an excessive amount of backlash for sure, and I can feel it right at the yoke. I do not believe this is going to be the U-joint here that's loose. It is definitely not. Actually, I can just feel the looseness with the pinion gear here. And I believe what I may have is a blown out pinion bearing. So we're going to go ahead and have to check for that. I think a good way will be to disconnect the drive shaft and then see if I have the same amount of play at the yoke, and that would confirm for sure. So I actually did do a rebuild on this thing. Gosh, it was well over 6 years ago, certainly well over 100,000 miles ago. And it was actually kind of around the time that I started getting into car stuff. And the car had a really bad rear end noise that turned out to be a differential carrier bearing noise. I had this car back to the dealer several times. They never got it fixed. I ended up doing research myself, fixing it myself, and the car's run great ever since. But, you know, with the type of driving I do and also with the known issues with these F-body rear ends being a little weaker than the horsepower that's put to them, it may be reasonable that there's some damage done here, but we'll go ahead and see. All right, whenever I remove a drive shaft, you'll notice a little balance thing here. I always like to maintain the relationship with the yoke. So I go ahead and I make a little paint mark across the retainer straps and the yoke and the drive shaft itself, just so I can make sure that if there's any kind of balance sensitivity or anything like that, that I can maintain this relationship so that the balance is retained when I put this back together. Okay, and I can definitely tell what our problem is here actually. This yoke is actually quite loose over the pinion gear. And what I believe actually it is not so much a problem with the pinion gear itself inside the differential, but I believe that my yoke nut here has loosened. I think I may have actually launched so hard I actually broke this nut loose a little bit because this yoke actually pulls back and forth a little bit, and it feels like it just needs to be tightened. So let me go ahead and just check and see if that's a reasonable assumption here. Oh yeah, most definitely. So the nut just loosened up so easily, and what happened is I think I just launched so hard I just either stripped this nut or just backed it off or something, and I can actually probably fix this by just tightening it back up again, but I'm not very comfortable with that. Actually, let me do this. Okay, that feels a lot better. The yoke was moving back and forth just a little bit on the splines, and now it's no longer doing that. And that play seems to be gone now, so let's see. Yeah, that backlash feels exactly right now. So I'm not totally comfortable without checking to make sure that there isn't any damage or anything in there, but I do believe that I must have stripped this nut or something like that. So let's go ahead and get this differential taken apart, do an inspection, and then I'm just going to reset the backlash and adjust it properly, and then we'll probably call it quits if there's nothing damaged in here. All right, so for you guys that are not familiar with these rear ends, this is a 10-bolt design. You've heard of 10-bolt, 12-bolt, things like that. That refers to the number of bolts on the differential cover, which I need to get removed here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this differential cover. I also want to take a look at what the oil looks like in there, see if there's any kind of metal shavings or anything. I did definitely head home the instant that I detected there was some kind of problem, so I don't believe I did any serious damage here. But anyway, you don't need to see me removing a whole bunch of bolts, do you? Okay, so one of the things I can notice is the fluid that's starting to drip through is perfectly clear, so that's actually a really good sign. And looking at our magnet here, we can see we've just got a very thin film I can feel of some metal dust here, so that's perfectly normal. So everything's indicating pretty good so far. All right, so now I want to go ahead and remove my axles and rotate the differential until I get my axle shaft lock bolt in play here. And actually, I just noticed that in turning this, now that I tighten that pinion bolt, that backlash is absolutely perfect. I can just tell by feel. We're going to measure it, of course, but that is absolutely what I set it at. So, but I still want to get this carrier out of here and inspect to make sure that my pinion bearing is okay and everything. I'm also going to check and make sure that I don't have any teeth missing or chewed up. They look very good on my ring gear here. So let's go ahead, and we got to get this carrier out. To do that, I need to get these axles out, which means I got to get this bolt out. So one little policy that I do, and we'll go over these little more intricate details when I do the rebuild video at some time in the next few weeks, but one thing that I definitely want to point out is I always toss these bolts here that retain the pinion shaft lock. These bolts are pretty thin, and they've got usually from the factory red Loctite on them, and they're on at a fairly good torque for their size. So the problem is you stretch these bolts and weaken them. If this bolt breaks and your pinion shaft lock comes out on you while you're driving, that's going to make for a very, very bad day. So these are only a few bucks. You can get them at the dealer, and I always just replace them. Now I need to remove my pinion shaft lock, and this will allow me to get my axles out. So to get the axles out, all I have to do is just push on the axle hub, push inwards towards the center of the car. And when I do that, we'll see the axle move in, and the C-clip that retains it should come into view. There it is. It just fell through, and you can just pick that out with your fingers or a magnet. And then support the axle as you remove it so you don't rest it on the seal and bend the seal and cause a leak. And there goes the axle shaft. And on the rebuild video, we'll talk about replacing these axle bearings and seals, but I can tell you this one's still in really good condition. I did replace them on my rebuild a long time ago. I can tell you this bearing in here is perfectly fine. So I will not be replacing those. We will cover that in the rebuild video when I get around to that. I do want to check the splines on my axle, though. That would also explain any kind of a noise problem, but all of my axle splines look good. And also my machine surfaces here where it would rest on the bearings or the seals look very, very good. They're absolutely perfectly smooth. Any kind of roughness there or excessive wear is going to cause leaks past the seal here, and that is not the case. So my axle looks great. With my axles removed, I can now go ahead and remove this carrier. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the bolts. Now, one thing, if you are not familiar with doing this type of work, as I mentioned in, I think it was that Mountaineer video that blew the whole differential, all the kingdom come. I mentioned in that video that you don't just take out a carrier, replace the bearings or whatever you're going to do to it, and then just pop it back in. It's not like that at all. there's some things you got to know about it, and not the least of which is the critical importance of setting the backlash for the ring gear and the pinion gear. That's, of course, the point of this video, and we'll get to that pretty soon here. But the other thing is we need to make sure that we mark these bearing caps here. So these carrier bearing retainer caps are very similar to like main engine bearing caps for like a crankshaft. And they have to go back on exactly the same location and the same orientation that you took them off, because they're machined for the axle housing here. So we need to make sure that there's some markings or something. When I did the rebuild the last time, I remember making some markings, but I don't really see them. I think maybe this might be them. I see there's a little punch mark right here on this number 703 right here. That seems to correspond to a little punch mark here. So I can use those marks for sure to align these bearing caps. And then I'll make some other mark on the other side. But it's critical that these bearing caps go back exactly the way you took them off. And don't use paint or anything, because these are really oily and the paint's not going to stick. So make some kind of permanent mark. Okay, so when I take these off, one difference from like an engine main bearing cap is that you'll see there is not actually a bearing that's on here. It just goes right over the race for the bearings for the carrier. So you still want to check to make sure that the machine surface is smooth though, and that there are no cracks or anything like that. And this looks very good here. So I'm going to set him aside and again make sure that I know I can put him back where I found him. We'll go ahead and check this guy out. And I'm going to put a towel under here because I have this speed sensor ring here that I don't want to take any chance of ruining any teeth on it. This carrier is going to be very heavy, and you're in an awkward position here if you're a do-it-yourselfer laying on your back. All right, so this guy looks really good as well here. And we are going to go ahead and pop this carrier out. Now, when we pop this carrier out, there's going to be some spacers, and I know I've got a number of spacers on the left side because of my setting the backlash last time. I do remember that. So we want to kind of take this out as a unit, staying together, so I can make sure everything stays on the side that it came from. So you can see here is all my spacers and everything. This is used to set your backlash. And we can also see that these little, they're sometimes called cones, or these little bearing races are also very loose here. So we want to make sure that we don't drop anything. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and put this over on the workbench. All right, so you can see our pinion here, and I'm checking to make sure there's no teeth missing or anything. And man, it looks good, and it actually feels perfect. So I don't think that I've actually got a bearing problem with it after all. I think I just launched right off of that lock nut is what I think. That feels absolutely perfect to me. But let's go ahead and remove that anyway. We're going to just double check it. All right, and we'll go through this in a lot more detail when I do the actual rebuild video, but we'll just run through some checks here real quick. So one of the things I'm amazed at, I'll show you, is the awesome condition still since my rebuild over 100,000 miles ago for this inner cone, for the inner pinion bearing, which is the one that's pressed onto your pinion gear. And by the way, that pinion bearing looks fantastic, by the way. I'm not even so sure we'll replace that. We'll kind of go ahead and see. But let me go ahead and show you this. But this cone I can see is in perfect condition. It's absolutely smooth. This was one of the conditions I had when I had to do the rebuild a long time ago, is that this cone was very, very rough. And of course, when the bearing races over the rough area, you get a grinding, grumbling noise. That is definitely not the case here. Also, we can see the outer bearing behind it there. The pinion seal is keeping that guy housed in, so I need to go ahead and remove that seal. All right, and I want to be careful to not ruin that outer bearing here when I pull this seal loose. There we go. And there goes our outer bearing, and wow, it's in just perfect condition. I actually can't believe it. I was positive that this was what my problem was going to be, was this bearing being blown, but that's definitely not the case. And I can also see the race for this bearing is perfectly smooth, just like the other one was. So yeah, again, we'll cover more of this stuff and how you would replace these races and components and what to look for more in the actual rebuild video. But let's go ahead and look at the carrier and the pinion on the bench and inspect those. And I think we may just go ahead and put this back together as it is and check the backlash on it, check the gear mesh pattern, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at our parts now. All right, we'll go over this in a lot more detail on the actual rebuild video, but for those of you guys that are not familiar, this is a carrier. These are your carrier bearings. Very, very often, these are what cause your rear end gear kind of sounding noise on a rear-wheel drive vehicle. What happens is these bearings go bad or the race gets really worn. We can see that this race is in perfect condition, absolutely smooth as silk. We can compare that with this race, which is actually the one that I saved when I did the rebuild a long time ago. And I can tell you this feels just like 60 grit sandpaper. It's very rough. What happens is when that bearing races over that rough spot like that, it just sounds like a roaring sound. And I actually saved this because these things are pretty handy for pressing in new bearings and things like that. But I'm going to set him well out of the way so I don't accidentally put him back on. But this looks absolutely perfect. So kind of a testament to my last rebuild. There is no wear on any of these parts, even with all of my driving my car like I stole it all this time. So normally you would replace these bearings on a rebuild and everything. I am not going to do that. The other thing you'd normally do is replace your pinion bearing. There is no need for me to do that. These bearings are pressed on, and what happens is when you replace these bearings, you kind of have to start all over setting your backlash. And we'll cover that in the rebuild video, but real basically, what backlash is the amount of play between your pinion gear and your ring gear. So just a couple things. Your ring gear, the diameter of the ring gear is what tells you whether you've got a 7.5 inch ring gear or an 8.5 inch ring gear. You've heard those terms. The other thing you'll often hear about rear ends is the rear end gear ratio. And what that refers to is as the drive shaft turns your pinion, as you see, it's going to turn the ring gear, which of course turns your axles. And basically the number of revolutions that the pinion gear makes to make one revolution of your ring gear, as you can see, the pinion gear is much smaller. It's going to take several revolutions before the ring gear makes one turn. That is your rear axle ratio. And that can be anywhere like 273, that would be 2.73 turns of your pinion gear versus one turn of your ring gear. In a really high performance application where you want to just get crazy 0 to 60 times, you might have a 410. That would be 4 revolutions of the pinion gear for every revolution of your ring gear. And basically the problem with that, while you're going to get off the line really easy and really quickly for your 0 to 60, it's going to greatly affect your top speed as well as your fuel economy because your engine's going to rev really high. But basically, another way to do that that's even easier is simply to count the number of teeth on the ring gear, divide that by the number of teeth on your pinion gear. That will also give you your ratio just the same, and probably a lot easier too. So what we're going to do here is I want to make sure that our backlash adjustment is right. And again, we'll cover this more in the rebuild video in a few weeks. But basically what we're looking for is when we put this back together, you have to remember your carrier, you can actually move side to side a little bit based on the number of spacers that you have. And the idea is to space this so that you have two things happen. First of all, so you have the correct amount of backlash, the correct amount of play between these gears. It should go without saying that if we use spacers to move the carrier further away from the pinion gear, there would be more play. And if we move closer to the pinion gear, there will be no play at all. We don't want to have a lot of play because that's going to cause a clunking when the gear is engaged. It can also damage the teeth. But we also don't want to have no play at all. We don't want them perfectly forced together like that, because that's going to create a lot of wear on those gears. So this backlash is critically important. If you do not set the backlash right, you're going to be doing a rear end rebuild in just a matter of a few months, actually. And at best, you're also going to have a lot of gear noise and clunking and things like that until that happens. Now, your backlash is not enough. The other thing that's important to note is that we can also adjust the depth of the pinion gear by using spacers on it as well. And the idea is that the spacing of the pinion gear, we want it so that the meat of the pinion gear touches into the meat or the center of your ring gear. You don't want to, for example, have your pinion gear like this, where it's riding on what's called the heel, because if you're only riding on the heel or the outside edge of the ring gear, then you're putting all that force on the very edge of the teeth. It should be obvious that probably those teeth are going to get damaged. Similarly, you don't want to be too close in and put all of the force on the toe or the inside edge. You also don't want to be too high up or too low in. So you really want to have it where your major points of contact are within this area that I drew in the black marker. You want it right in the center of the teeth. And you'll notice that these teeth are curved. And speaking of the curve on the teeth, the outside curve here is known as the drive side of the gear, and then you've got this other side on the opposite side of the tooth, and that curve is called the coast side. You also want to make sure that you have the same pattern right in the center region of that tooth on the coast side as well as on the drive side. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a marking compound. We're going to basically put some paint on the ring gear when we install this thing, and then the paint is going to be removed by the pinion gear when we run the paint through the pinion gear, and then we're going to look at the removal pattern of the paint, and that's going to help us determine where the gear mesh pattern is and see that we've got a good gear pattern. So it gets a little complicated, and again, we'll do it more in the rebuild video. But the idea is that if we don't have a good gear pattern, we're going to have to move this pinion gear in or out. But remember, moving the pinion gear in or out will affect our backlash, which means that we have to move the carrier in and out with its spacers. So you kind of go back and forth a little bit until you get it right. I don't think we're going to have to do it on this video because I'm not going to replace the pinion bearing or the carrier bearings. Those would affect your backlash and your gear pattern because you're never going to press them on to the same exact location that you had them before. But when we do the rebuild video, we definitely will be replacing those, and we'll show you how to properly set a backlash from scratch. But let's go ahead and finish our inspection here real quick. We can see that our carrier bearings look good. We can see our spider gears inside look good. No missing teeth. Everything looks great. This collar is a crush collar. We have to replace this with a new one. The crush collar, when you tighten your pinion gear, it's going to crush this collar down. Obviously, it will not uncrush when you remove it. So I'll have to buy a new crush collar. The other thing we want to check, especially on this car, is our outer pinion bearing that lives behind that pinion seal. And this is what I actually thought blew out, but it's actually perfectly fine. So just simply because it's so easy to replace and I have to go to the parts store anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and get a replacement one of these. But I actually really don't need one. It's clearly in very good shape. But what I definitely want to check is that my yoke splines are good and they look absolutely perfect. And we're going to check to make sure that they match over our pinion, and they do, so that's all good. So the one thing that I'm really worried about, because my differential diagnosis, get it, is that the nut, I clearly must have launched right off of this nut. We want to make sure that these threads are in good shape on this pinion gear, and they most definitely are, so I'm not too worried about that. But if I look at the threads on the nut here, I can see that they are stripped. So what clearly happened is I just launched right through this pinion nut, and I can clearly see that these threads are absolutely stripped on it. So I'm going to definitely want to get a new pinion nut. And I will admit, I'm not so sure that I did that the last time on my rebuild, so I guess I got away for quite some time with that. But I want to get a new pinion nut and some red Loctite to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But I do believe that when we put this back together, I will have it perfectly fixed and there won't be any issues. All right, I've got the parts I need. I actually got a couple of crush collars. You only get one chance to torque the pinion bolt to the accurate position. If you have to back it off, then of course you're backing off of your crush collar and you can't uncrush it. So I got a couple of those just to be safe. I also got a new axle shaft lock bolt. As I mentioned, it's a good idea to replace these. Don't reuse these, especially on the GM models and especially on a high performance model. I also want to make sure that my new outer pinion bearing has the same dimensions as the old one did, and that will ensure again that my pinion depth is retained exactly as before, and it is. And the most important part, a brand new pinion lock nut. So I also got some red Loctite for this thing, and I believe that securing this thing back on is going to get us back on the road and back to eating up rice boys.